Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and today we're putting the Nat-zees in the ground and declaring victory in Europe. But it's going to be victory with a question mark. Did we really win World War II in Europe? Now, we're going to follow that outline right up above my head. So put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow, because you should almost have a really good answer to that question on the lower left. Evaluate FDR's Germany First policy. What was its goal? What did it cost? What did it lead to? Were Marshall and King right, or even kind of half right? In light of how the Second World War developed, was Germany First a wise decision, especially given the alternatives? How did it shape the post-war world? But to answer that question, we have to start talking about ethics. We have to start talking about morality. Is it morally correct to allow some people in one part of the world to die in order to save another group of people in another part of the world? What is the ethical decision? And to prepare you for that, we're going to talk about morality. We're going to talk about questions of morality and do these two little morality exercises. Let's look at that one on the upper left. You can find these on the internet. That's where I found them. Now let's look at that one on the upper left. Here is the scenario. There is a runaway trolley car barreling down the tracks, and there are 5 people tied in the path of that runaway trolley car. They're screaming, they're begging for help, but they can't escape, and no one is going to help them. You are the only person that can change their fate. You are standing in front of a switch, and you can throw that switch and change the path of the trolley, putting it on an alternate track. But there is one person tied to the rail of this alternate track. So in flipping that switch, you will save those 5 people, but you will condemn that one person. What is the ethical decision? Is it morally correct to throw that switch and kill the one person in order to save the 5? Here's another scenario, a little more complicated one. There it is on the lower left. Again, a runaway trolley car is barreling down the tracks, and there are 5 people tied to the path of that trolley car. They're begging for their lives, they're screaming, but they can't escape, and no one is going to help them. You are the only person that can change their fate. You are watching the scene unfold on a bridge overlooking the rail next to a really big, really fat guy. And it occurs to you, you could grab this really fat guy and throw him off the bridge. Throw him in the path of the runaway trolley car, because he's so big and he's so fat that he will actually derail the trolley car and thus save the lives of those 5 people. What is the ethical decision here? Is it morally correct to intentionally kill the one person in order to save the 5? Because in World War II, these were not abstract ethical problems. They were real life problems involving real people and questions of life and death. Because as the Allies began to liberate Europe from the Nazis, they began to come across things that looked like that. Concentration camps. Now, these photographs are taken from the American liberation of the Dachau concentration camp, which occurred on April 27, 1945. Because in World War II, this wasn't an abstract moral exercise. This was a matter of life and death for real people. If people lived or if people died, it depended on how quickly the Allies could arrive to save them. The Americans, the British, even the Russians, among others. Thousands of people saved in one part of the world meant that thousands would perish in another. This is the thing I want you to put in your notes. That's one of the things I want you to remember. The Germany First strategy was neither morally clear nor morally neutral. It privileged people in Europe at the expense of people in the Pacific. As the Allied armies began to enter Germany and Poland itself, they began to encounter the nightmare of these Nazi concentration camps. Now, what these camps were these enormous open-air prisons where prisoners were beaten, starved, tortured, worked to death. Now, some of these camps were just prisons. They were just designed to hold POWs. Others were these slave labor camps. Others were just straight up extermination camps designed to just kill as many people as quickly as possible. They're designed to mechanically slaughter large numbers of people whom the Nazis decided were undesirable subhumans. Now, Dachau, in particular, was one of these prisoner of war camps, and it was liberated by the Americans in April of 1945. Now, Dachau mostly held German political prisoners. Most of the people the Germans killed at Dachau were other Germans. And at Dachau, they would kill somewhere around 32,000 people as part of the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust itself began at the height of Nazi power in January of 1942 at the resort of Wannsee, just outside of Berlin. And there's the building. I mean, it's still there today. This is the very infamous Wannsee Conference. This is where senior Nazi Party officials, led by that guy right up above me, Adolf Eichmann, he met to discuss the problem of what to do with the huge population of Jews in the conquered portions of Europe. Eventually, they decided that the only real solution to all of the Jews of Europe was a final solution. They planned the extermination of 17 million Jewish Europeans. They did it in that building, led by that guy right up above me. Now, these undesirable subhumans, according to the Nazis, were mostly Jews, but it wasn't just Jews. It also included the Roma, that's what the Gypsies call themselves, homosexuals, mentally disabled, Seventh-day Adventists, and even people with dwarfism or midgets, people with obvious birth defects. They would all be exterminated. They would be arrested across the conquered portions of Europe, moved into these large, squalid ghettos inside of cities, eventually processed at various prison camps before being moved east to the big extermination centers located in Poland, places like Auschwitz. And there is the gate of Auschwitz there on the upper left. At these extermination camps, the prisoners would be searched, they would be stripped, they were told to take off their clothes to enter the showers, but the showers were not showers. They were gas chambers. The Germans would then kill the people in the showers and then dispose of the bodies in these massive crematoriums. And inside these extermination camps, the Nazis would kill roughly 6 to 7 million people. And it was the mechanical and cold-blooded nature of this extermination that gives the Holocaust, also known as the Shoah, its particular horror. I mean, you can see the little diagram there on the upper left. They would have a fake train station. The people would get off onto the fake train station. They would move into these barracks where they thought they were going to live. They would be compelled to undress. They would be moved into the showers, which were actually gas chambers. And then once they were all killed, their remains would be cremated and buried into these huge mass graves. And, you know, you look at that picture on the lower left, all of those people are about to die, and they would die after this photograph was taken. Now, this thing, I mean, it would take a psychopath to even dream of such a thing, to dream of a machine designed to mechanically exterminate large numbers of people. It is a thing of nightmare that anybody could even conceive of such a thing. But the Nazis didn't conceive of it. They planned it. They built it. And they put these things in operation. And they killed millions of people in these extermination camps. Now, I have to pause for a moment and talk about morons and bigots. There does exist a substantial literature that argues against the reality of the Holocaust. And you can see it in these books right up above my head. These books are trying to deny that the Holocaust ever happened, or that it wasn't as severe as was estimated, or that it was mostly an accident that took place during the war. All of these people are wrong. They are all a mix of tendentious, disingenuous morons and bigots. There is massive historical and archaeological evidence for the Holocaust. It is not a question whether the Holocaust happened or not. The question is that there wasn't just one Holocaust. There were many Holocausts. World War II saw a huge harvest of death. And here are the Holocausts of the worst nations of World War II. There's Nazi Germany in the Holocaust itself. The Shoah, the planned extermination of the European Jewish people, somewhere around 6 million people were killed. But the Nazis didn't just kill Jewish people. There we have the planned murder of Soviet POWs, 3.3 million people. There's the murder of Russian civilians, 10 million Russian civilians killed in World War II. Then there's the murder of Polish civilians, 1.8 million. There's the extermination of the Roma, the Gypsies, homosexuals, Unionists, Seventh-day Adventists, people with birth defects, 350,000 people murdered by the Nazis. These are the people tied to the tracks in front of that runaway locomotive. And there, Holocausts were not limited to Europe. They weren't limited to Nazi Germany. There are the Holocausts of Imperial Japan. This included the murder of Chinese civilians, 10 million Chinese civilians killed in World War II in the Pacific by the Imperial Japanese. 4 million Indonesians, 500,000 Filipinos. The outrageous murder and torture of Allied prisoners of war, 138,000 were killed. And in the labor camps of Southeast Asia, a part of the war I haven't even discussed, 100,000 people were murdered by the Imperial Japanese. And again, it wasn't just Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan that killed massive numbers of people. It included one of our own allies, Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia itself killed 200,000 Polish civilians. They murdered 220,000 people when they liberated the nations of the Balkans. And when they moved into Europe itself, they murdered somewhere around 380,000 German POWs. They murdered around 2 million German civilians. And the Russians eventually murdered 200,000 of their own people who were not sufficiently committed to the communist ideal. And these are not set numbers because these numbers keep going up. Even to this day, they are continually rediscovering new mass graves across Central and Eastern Europe. In Poland, there's the 1,800 German civilians found in a recently discovered mass grave. There's another mass grave found in Slovenia. Another 1,000 executed Jewish people found in Belarus. Those numbers are still going up as we learn about the scale of the murders that took place in World War II. And American hands aren't necessarily clean either, because during the war, Allied strategic bombing ostensibly targeted enemy industry and production. But, when those bombers flew over these cities, the bombs were inaccurate, target locations were vague, Allied commanders were callous, and sympathy was lacking. If you and your group of bombers were on your way to hit a ball bearing factory, and instead you went slightly off target and wiped out a German suburb, who cares? They're just Germans. Entire German and Japanese cities vanished under waves of airdropped bombs. The goal was to cripple these enemy nations, to defeat the Axis, and shorten the war. And America did things like that on the lower left, taking the German city of Dresden and turning it into a pile of ruins, killing tens of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. Between the U.S. and Allied bombing, 600,000 German civilians are killed from the air and 230,000 Japanese civilians. Was this a morally correct thing to do? To sacrifice these innocent people to shorten the war? Was it ethically correct? Did it shorten the war? Yes, it clearly did. But it killed a lot of innocent people. And this is how the German civilians saw the Americans. Not as liberators, not as people freeing them, but as murderers tossing bombs from the night sky, as giants smashing German cities with bloody, bomb-filled feats. There's the little poster right up above my head that shows how the Germans saw the Americans during the war, as a great giant murdering people across Germany. And those are just the conventional bombs. That doesn't even include the pair of atomic flashes over Japan in 1945. But I want to return to what happened in April of 1945 in Dachau, because I want to explain to you what happened, and I want you to think about morality. I want you to think about ethics, because this is what happened when the Americans liberated Dachau. The American infantry took the city, took the camp. The German officers surrendered. They were disarmed. They were placed up against a wall. And then the American soldiers went around liberating the prison camp, opening the barracks. And they looked at these mass graves. They looked at people that had been tied to posts and left to starve. They found people that had been partially eaten by the German dogs. And then they went back to those SS guards. And then a 19-year-old said, look, they're trying to escape. And then they shot them all. The American soldiers shot somewhere between 100 and 200 German POWs at Dachau. They just shot them. These German soldiers were unarmed. These German soldiers had already surrendered. And there's the moral question. Were the American soldiers wrong to execute these Nazis who had just run a prisoner of war concentration camp for years and had just murdered 32,000 people? Because when you start talking about that question on the lower left, evaluate the Germany First policy, I want you to think about morality. I want you to think about poor people tied to the tracks of runaway trolley cars. And is it morally just to kill some people in order to save others? All right, here's the situation, January 1944. Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany have battled back and forth across Eastern Europe. The U-boats have been forced from the Atlantic. The Italian front has been stalemated completely. And in the Pacific, right up above my head, Imperial Japan was dominant. They were busy fortifying all of these islands across the Pacific and rebuilding their navy after the disaster of the Battle of Midway. By 1944, was Germany First actually working? Because the Germans did not think they were going to lose the war. Because by early 1944, Nazi Germany was holding its own. That's what it looked like right up above my little yellow box. The Russian advances in the east had been slowed down, if not halted in places. The Allies had been effectively stopped in Italy, and the Atlantic Wall guarded the coasts of France and Norway. Now, the Germans had developed these all-new weapons, new and terrible super weapons, weapons that they thought would win them the war. All Germany thinks it needs to do is to hold out for another year. They can just hold out through 1944, because if they can make it to 1945, these new secret super weapons can make their appearance on the battlefield. The Germans did not think they were going to lose the war. All they had to do was hang on until the winter of 1944, until these super weapons could be processed and built in large numbers. And when I say super weapons, the Germans had super weapons. These included the very first military assault rifle, the Sturmgewehr. This included the super tank, the mighty Tiger main battle tank, and its even heavier brother, the King Tiger. No one had anything else like these tanks. This included jet fighters that could fly higher and faster than any plane that the Americans or the Russians had. And it also included terrible new rocket weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, where the Germans could sit back in Germany and just continually launch these rockets at their enemies, causing death and destruction all the way from Great Britain to Moscow. And to protect them while they produced these super weapons, there was the Atlantic Wall. And this is the Atlantic Wall, if you don't remember. The Atlantic Wall were this system of fortifications that stretched all the way from France up into Norway. It consisted of bunkers and pillboxes placed above the beach, and on the beach itself was barbed wire, tank traps, mines, machine guns guarded the beach, and behind the machine guns, artillery and mortar. The Germans thought that the Atlantic Wall was unpenetrable, and they didn't think the Americans or the British could sacrifice the kind of men required to crack through the Atlantic Wall. But the Americans had to do it. The only way to defeat Nazi Germany is to smash through that Atlantic Wall. And through the spring of 1944, the Allies prepared for their attack on the Atlantic Wall. And this had to take place in the summer of 1944, because by the end of 1944, winter is going to come and you're not going to be able to move an army across the English Channel. And then it's going to be 1945 and those German super weapons come online. They have to crack the Atlantic Wall in the summer of 1944. The thought was, if the Germans get those super weapons, they're going to defeat the Russians in the east. This attack, which was planned right up above me, you can see it, was going to be the largest amphibious landing in world history. And they were going to call the day that this attack was planned D-Day. And D-Day took place on June 6th, 1944. Now, D-Day was the opening attack in one of the most critical battles in world history. This thing, you can see it, it's right there in all caps, the Battle of Normandy. And on June 6th, 150,000 soldiers surged across the English Channel. Armies of Americans, Canadians, the British, and the French, side by side, smashed into and through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. And while they succeeded, while they did in fact break through the Atlantic Wall, the losses were horrific. 10,000 men died in 12 hours. Now, while D-Day gets a lot of the attention, the entire fight was the Battle of Normandy, and it took place on that map on the upper left. Now, the Battle of Normandy raged all the way from June to August of 1944. The Allies, the Americans, the British, the Canadians, and the French fought together against the Nazi forces in northern France. And losses were unbelievable. In all of these smashed little French towns, the Allies lost almost 250,000 soldiers in these tiny little towns. They slowly pushed the Germans back from the coast and then broke the German army in France by the end of August. The shattered German army then retreated across France, hotly pursued by the Americans, the Canadians, the British, and the French. And they entered the French capital on August 25th, 1944. For the first time since, for years, the French capital is now freed. There's Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, walking into this city. Now, Hitler had actually ordered Paris itself to be burned to the ground, but the German officer refused to carry out the order. So instead, he spared one of the most beautiful cities on earth. And there we have it. Oh, there's right up above me, American soldiers doing a little tourist thing in front of the Eiffel Tower. And the Soviets knew D-Day was going to happen. So they coordinated with the D-Day landings, and the Russians launched a massive offensive in the east, smashing the German armies in Poland and in Romania. And as the German lines collapsed, the Soviets entered Eastern Europe. Both Romania and Bulgaria, like Italy before them, had been allies of the Germans, but quickly switched sides. But as Soviet Russia advanced in Eastern Europe, it did not liberate these countries, but instead imposed communist governments on all of these places. And they simply established smaller versions of the Soviet terror state in all of these places, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Hungary, and so on. And the Russians began to liberate the concentration camps they found in Eastern Europe. Even the tough-minded Russians were deeply, deeply shocked at what they found. Now, I have very carefully tailored the images of what I'm going to show you about the Holocaust and about what the Nazis did. And if you're of a mind to see more gruesome photographs, you can find them. But just suffice to say that that pile of ashes on the upper left, that used to be a couple thousand people. And the Russians hardened even more so. Stalin proposed the execution of the entirety of the German officer corps. Everything sergeant and above, Stalin said, had to simply be shot. The Russians, never inclined to take prisoners anyway, simply began to casually execute German officers. And as the Russians entered Germany itself, they took a terrible revenge on the German people, unleashing waves of death and sexual violence against the German people. It was said that every German woman between age 10 and 60 would be raped multiple times by Russian soldiers. German POWs, these poor soldiers that actually managed to surrender, would often be taken deep inside Soviet Russia and used as slave labor for years after the war was over. Some of these German POWs didn't even come back to Germany until the late 1950s and into the 1960s. A desperate Germany attempted one final gamble, a surprise Christmas offensive against the Americans, who they viewed as weak. They tried to use their little blitzkrieg one final time. This is the very infamous Battle of the Bulge, the final attack of Nazi Germany that takes place in December of 1944 and into January of 1945. It began with German soldiers disguised as American soldiers, wearing American uniforms and simply massacring any American soldiers they came across. They bent the Allied line back, creating a huge bulge in the armies trying to break through. But they'd underestimated the fighting spirit of the Americans. And in particular, one town, a very important crossroads, right there, called Bastogne. The American 101st Airborne fortified itself in the town, and alone, outnumbered and surrounded and trapped, the Americans fought in Bastogne. This is the very famous Battling Bastards of Bastogne. And the Battling Bastards of Bastogne hunkered down and hoped for only one person that could come and save them. And that guy is George Patton. Now, George Patton himself had actually been fired at the end of the successful campaign in Sicily over a soldier slapping incident where he basically beat a soldier who had suffered from combat fatigue, from PTSD. So the Americans fired him, and Patton begged and begged to be returned to combat command. And they finally placed him in command of the Third Army. And it was the Third Army that was just south of the Battle of the Bulge. And this is what is known as Patton's finest hour. George Patton does the impossible. He turns his entire army 90 degrees. It was facing east, and now it is facing north. And he launches a huge counterattack on the southern edge of the Germans inside the bulge itself, supported by massive air support. And right after Christmas, Patton arrives to relieve the trapped soldiers at Bastogne. And there's one of Patton's tanks there on the lower left. The day after Christmas, he gives these trapped soldiers the best present they've ever seen. This is the last offensive Germany will ever launch. Throughout 1945, Nazi Germany disintegrated. Entire army units broke apart. Nazi leaders began to flee the country along these things known as rat lines, trying to escape to South America. The only resistance left inside Germany itself was from suicidal Nazis and collections of old men and young boys. Look at that picture there on the lower left. That's all that's left of the mighty German war machine by 1945. 11-year-olds with grenades and rifles. By 1945, American and Russian soldiers meet on the River Elbe. Germany had been cut in half. And there's the photograph right up above me. Americans hanging out with Russians, talking guns. And that's the Elbe River behind them. The last major fight in Europe is at the Battle of Berlin, April to May 1945. Soviet armies surround the German capital and attack from all sides. The exhausted Germans, mostly teenagers, hung on for about a month of brutal street-to-street fighting. But you're pitching 11-year-olds against Russian tanks? That's it. And on May 2nd, 1945, the German capital falls, and the Russians raise the flag of the Soviet Union over the defeated Germans. Rather than be taken prisoner, Hitler commits suicide on April 30th. Soviet soldiers capture the bunker, and they capture the remains of Hitler's body. Even to this day, nobody knows exactly what the Russians did with Hitler's body. Nobody knows. There's a lot of people die in April. 2 days before Hitler, Italian guerrillas captured and executed Mussolini and hung his body upside down from the town square so that everybody knew the Italian fascist was dead. The fragments of Nazi Germany begged for a chance of surrender. The war in Europe was over. This was VE Day, May 8th, 1945. And there is the last shattered fragments of Nazi Germany begging for surrender. There's a huge party. People kiss nurses. People wave flags. In London, people get super drunk. Victory in Europe has been achieved. But it is a victory that FDR never saw. On April 12th, 1945, a very ill Roosevelt dies. The nation is gripped with sorrow, mourning the passing of one of the most popular and influential presidents in American history. People openly weep in the streets. Parallels are immediately made with Abraham Lincoln, himself a great president who never saw the end of the war that he had to reluctantly fight. Harry Truman becomes president. It will be up to Harry Truman to finish the war, especially the war in the Pacific. Now, Germany ceased to exist as an independent nation for years. After it surrendered, it was divided up into various sections, each section governed by a different allied power. The Russians got a slice, the French got a slice, the British got a slice, the Americans got a slice, and even Poland got a big slice of Germany. And the capital itself was divided into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, Russian, and French zones of occupation. And the cleanup of Germany began, being done almost entirely by the surviving women of Germany. Most of the soldiers were dead, or the men were still trapped in these prisoner of war camps. It was up to these poor, traumatized women of Germany to rebuild their shattered nation. And it was a process that would take years and years, if not decades. Throughout 1946, the Allies held the Nuremberg Trials. All caps, so you know it's important. And the Nuremberg Trials were these criminal proceedings where they charged the surviving Nazi leaders with war crimes and crimes against humanity, bringing the evidence of the sheer number of people that the Nazis murdered to the public eye and showing people what the Nazis did. Over 1,600 Nazi leaders were convicted both in Germany and in trials across Germany. Most of these Nazis were given long prison sentences, some of them given lifelong prison sentences, and over 200 of them would be executed. And there's the Nazi there in the upper left. That's Hermann Göring. That's the guy that ordered the terror bombings of Guernica, the terror bombings in London. And he actually commits suicide before he's executed. But yeah, as long as he's dead, it's fine by me. We just got to put these Nazis in the ground. Now, the Nuremberg trials do something very interesting. The Nuremberg trials give a kind of absolution to the war. They give an absolution to the German nation. They allow this public, collective expression of guilt that basically allows Germany as a nation to move forward. They acknowledge the terrible crimes of Nazi Germany and can move forward as a people into the future. Because, the people that did this paid for what they did. Well, most of them paid for what they did. Because notably absent among the Nazis at Nuremberg was the architect of the Holocaust himself, Adolf Eichmann. He vanishes towards the end of the war, probably along one of these rat lines to South America. No one knew where he vanished to, and people hunted Adolf Eichmann for years. But across Eastern Europe, the Soviet Empire replaced the Nazi Empire, imposing this iron curtain across Europe. Stalin had promised to respect pre-war borders. Stalin had promised to respect democracy. He did neither. Instead, he simply conquered 5 nations and absorbed them into Soviet Russia. He imposed a repressive communism on the rest. Look at that poster right up above my little yellow box. That's a German poster hailing Stalin, their great leader. And on that poster, Stalin is referred to as Der Führer. They start using Hitler's old title to describe Joseph Stalin. And this raises some interesting questions. some very interesting questions about victory in Europe. Like, what were we there for? All right. After all, what did we go to Europe to do? Were we there to liberate the people of Europe? Were we there just to destroy the Nazis? Were we there to free the oppressed nations of Europe? Because we didn't free all of the people of Europe. We only freed about half of them. We didn't liberate the oppressed nations of Europe. We only liberated the western half of Europe. Were we there to spread democracy and human rights? Because we only established democracy and human rights in half of Europe. And people pointed this out. And one of the really annoying people that pointed this out, Truman hated this guy, was George Patton himself. And this is what Patton says. Patton points out the hypocrisy of the war in Europe. He says, look, we promised the Europeans freedom. It would be worse than dishonorable not to see that they have it. This might mean war with the Russians, but what of it? I'll say this, the Third Army alone, with very little help and with damned few casualties, could lick what is left of the Russians in 6 weeks. You mark my words, don't forget them. Someday we'll have to fight these Russians, and it will take 6 years and cost us 6 million lives. And people are like, Patton, you can't say things like that. Patton, the Soviet Russians are our allies. They helped us destroy Nazi Germany. And Patton is like, the Soviet Russians are committing atrocities across Europe. He correctly points out that the Soviets liberated Nazi concentration camps, cleaned them up, and then reopened them so that the Soviets could then murder the enemies of the Soviet state. The Russians actually reopened some of the old German concentration camps. And he's like, look, if we're here to liberate Europe, let's liberate Europe. If we're here to spread democracy and freedom, let's spread democracy and freedom. If it should be necessary for us to fight the Russians, Patton says, the sooner we do it, the better. And he goes on, we should not have stopped at Berlin. We should have pushed straight through to Moscow. And President Truman is like, we're not going to go to war with the Russians. You can't say these things, Patton. You can't just casually insult our allies, the Russians. We're trying to work with the Russians here. We're trying to save people in Eastern Europe without war. When we think we can do it. And Patton said, you can't do it. Russians have no regard for human life, and they are all out sons of bitches, barbarians, and chronic drunks. Does Patton have a point? Because Stalin broke Germany right in half. He broke all of Europe right in half. You can see from the map, he enslaved and oppressed the eastern half of an entire continent. The Soviet domination of Europe was a direct result of FDR's Germany First policy and all of the tremendous help that FDR gave the Soviets back in 1942 and 1943. And the Soviets conquered the eastern half of the European continent. And we did end up fighting the Russians, because after the World War II comes the Cold War. We didn't fight the Russians in a hot shooting war. Instead, we just resented them for the next 50 years in the Cold War. Now, the Cold War was this conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, which would dominate international politics for the next 50 years, as these two former allies sought to undermine each other at every opportunity. But neither side wanted to enter into a direct war with the others, because both the United States and the Soviet Union, both by this time, had nuclear weapons. So during the Cold War, the Americans and the Russians fight each other in these proxy wars. We don't fight each other directly. We have our guys fight their guys, and they have their guys fight our guys. And during the 50 years of the Cold War, there's somewhere between 6 and 20 proxy wars, depending on how you count them. So, we did end up fighting the Russians. All wars begin very messily. All wars end very messily. And World War II is no exception. And the irony of the end of World War II in Europe, the reason we have to put that question mark with victory, the irony comes with what the Russians did with Poland. Now remember, in Europe, World War II started in 1939. It started over this conflict over the integrity of Polish borders and the integrity of Polish democracy. The Germans violated Polish borders and extinguished Polish democracy. That's why the war started. We advance forward to 1945, and World War II ends with the Soviet Union violating Polish borders and extinguishing Polish democracy. They basically sliced off the entire eastern third of Poland. They changed the shape of the entire country. Soviet Russia took away the western third of Poland, just added it to the Russians. But they gave the Polish the western third of Germany. They moved the entire country several hundred miles to the west. And Germany itself is broken for the next 40 years. Germany itself is divided into two countries, democratic West Germany and communist East Germany. They only unified in 1990 at the very end of the Cold War. Here's my question. Was Patton right? Was Patton even half right? Or was Patton just completely wrong? Did we liberate the people of Europe? And if we didn't liberate all the people of Europe, can we really say that we won the war in Europe at all? Now, after the Holocaust, after the Shoah, most European Jews became convinced that Europe would never be home to the Jewish people. They became convinced that the only way for the Jewish people to survive would be to form a Jewish state. And you can see with that map on the left, many of the Jewish people of Europe abandoned Europe completely, taking all of their brains and their talent and their money to a new country in the south. Many of these people returned to the traditional Jewish homeland of Israel, which had been destroyed by the Romans 2,000 years beforehand. And these European Jews combined together with the Jewish people of the Middle East, it's roughly a 50-50 situation, and they create an entirely new country, the State of Israel, which was born in 1948. Now, at least in terms of Germany, you should have an answer to that question right there. You should have a pretty good idea of how to evaluate the Germany First policy, especially in terms of morality and ethics. Is it ethical to save people in Europe while allowing people in Asia to die? And a lot of people died in both Europe and Asia. I don't want to get too maudlin about this, but we send millions of Americans to Europe, and 276,000 of them do not come back. And we have these fields of white crosses. Oh, there's a Star of David. Under each one of those markers is a person. All right? They went over there and they gave everything for Europe. They gave everything for World War II. And the Americans got off easy. Look at these losses across Europe. 20 million Russians. All right? 85,000 Finns, 600,000 French, 500,000 Greeks, almost 500,000 Englishmen die in World War II. This is death on a massive scale. What was it for? You should have a really good idea about that, because we're going to turn to what happens in the Pacific in 1944, 1945, and I will see you there. But there's an addendum I want to talk about before I go, and that is the hunt for Adolf Eichmann. Now, at the end of the war, Adolf Eichmann had vanished. He had escaped along the rat lines to South America. And in the late 1950s, a German in Argentina recognized him in the street. There he is right there. Adolf Eichmann had escaped to Argentina. He had changed his name, and he was attempting to blend in among the Argentinian people. But it was one of the Germans that turned him in, and let it be known, the architect of the Holocaust is right over there. He's right over there. And one night in 1960, a pair of secret agents appear and they snatch Adolf Eichmann off the street. They inject him with a sedative. They load him onto a plane. They tell the crew that he's drunk and they fly him halfway across the world. And Adolf Eichmann finally regains consciousness and says, "Where am I?" And that's when they inform Adolf Eichmann that he has been arrested and he will be put on trial in Israel. And this is the very famous trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1960-1961. There is the Nazi war criminal there on the upper left being forced to explain why he did this to the Jewish nation of Israel. And the Eichmann trial in Israel is when this Jewish nation finally directly confronts what happened in the Holocaust, why the Germans did what they did. And they force Adolf Eichmann to admit that he planned the murder of 17 million people. He only got 6 million of them, though. He is, of course, completely guilty, and Adolf Eichmann is finally executed in 1962. His last words, the despicable, long live Germany.